How are you, students? Now we will continue on the third chapter, learning and learning theories. So at the end of this unit or this chapter, you will going to explain the following points. The first one is explain the meaning of learning, types of learning and factors which affect students' learning. Second, identify the characteristics of learning. What are the features of students' learning? Thirdly, you will going to describe some of the theories which are designed to explain the characteristics of learning. Then you will going to also differentiate the viewpoints of or the vantage points of different learning theories. Then you will discuss the application of theories and learning theories in the daily reading process, learning process, and in your walk of life. And finally, you will going to state the techniques used to motivate and reinforce students' behavior or an individual behavior. These are some of the learning outcomes or objectives which are expected from the students at the end of this chapter. Okay, saying this, I will focus on the key points or key questions of chapter 3. At the end of this chapter, you will going to also explain or answer the following questions. The first one is, what is learning? At the end of this chapter, everybody shall define or put the meaning of learning. Then you will going to list down different examples of learning activities. What are learning? After you define the word learning, you should also list down or put some of the activities of students' learning activity. The other one, what are the characteristics of learning? Like human beings, learning has its own characteristics. So everybody should explain the important features of learning. What are the principles of learning? Learning requires a certain principles. So you will going to explain, you will going to identify the major principles of learning activity. Question 5, which factors affect learning? There are different factors that may affect either in a positive direction or in a negative direction. Hopefully, you are going to identify these important factors which affect your learning process. The other one is, what are the theories of learning? Learning has different theories which were formulated by different philosophers, psychologists, and interested experts who were working in the area of psychology. So as a student, you will going to identify the basic theories of learning. The other important point under this chapter is a stimulus. What is a stimulus? What is a stimuli? Eventually, or at the end of this chapter, you have to have an idea about stimulus and the importance of stimulus, and what are the advantage, the value of stimulus. The other point, what are the elements of classical conditioning? Learning has different theories. From different theories, one of a theory which explains about learning is classical conditioning. So you will have an idea What is classical conditioning? What are the components or the elements of classical conditioning? The other point you have to answer or you have to give explanation is what are the principles of classical conditioning. Not only knowing the concept of classical conditioning, not only knowing the elements or the components of classical conditioning, but also you have to identify the major principles that are highly helpful to carry out or to conduct classical conditioning. To this effect, you can easily realize or understand the importance of classical conditioning in the learning process. The other point is what is operant conditioning. You are going to define, you are going to explain operant conditioning, the concept of operant conditioning, how far operant conditioning is valuable in the learning process. Besides, you will also compare operant conditioning with classical conditioning, and also it is possible to compare operant conditioning with other types of theories which are explained the concept of learning. The other important point you have to know in this chapter is what is primary reinforcement, what are secondary reinforcement. Before that, you have to also define, you have to understand the concept of reinforcement. What is reinforcement? Who are the reinforcers? What are the reinforcers? How we reinforce animals, human beings? For what purpose? If we reinforce people or students, which reinforcers are used or employed? So what are the primary reinforcers? What are the secondary reinforcers? These are the point. Question number 13, what are positive reinforcement and what are negative reinforcement? We reinforce our students or we reinforce an individual to see the likelihood of desirable behavior. So mostly we use or we employ reinforcement to initiate a certain behavior that is good behavior, that is desirable behavior. But when we reinforce an individual or a student, we may use positive reinforcer or negative reinforcer. So at the end of this chapter, one of the tasks of you is explaining, identifying the concept of positive as well negative reinforcement. In addition to this, you will also define or explain reinforcement schedule. What is the reinforcement schedule? What is the concept of interval and ratio reinforcement schedule? You will going to put your explanation also. The other key questions on this chapter is what is continuous reinforcement, what is intermittent or partial reinforcement. From this chapter, you need to know about continuous reinforcement in one aspect and intermittent or reinforcement which is given sparingly or sometimes. So what is the advantage of using continuous or intermittent reinforcement in our experiment? Question number 19, what is the difference between a ratio and interval schedule? When we shall use ratio schedule reinforcement? When shall we apply interval reinforcement schedule? You have to identify their similarities and difference, as well their advantages. Question number 20, what is punishment? You are going to define, you are going to explain, you are going to describe the meaning, the concept of punishment. Then you are going to explain the difference between positive and negative punishment. Like reinforcement, here we have also positive and negative punishment. Hopefully, you are going to explain, you are going to realize primarily about positive and negative punishment. Then you will also compare either positive or negative punishment with positive and negative reinforcement. That is one of the funny part of this chapter. What are the pros and cons of punishment? We may use punishment for the purpose of decreasing the likelihood of aversive behavior or unwanted behavior. We parents or we teachers may apply or may employ punishment for the purpose of decreasing the occurrence or the likelihood of unwanted behavior. But when we use punishment, we will get a product or advantage in one part, and we may face disadvantage. So pros and cons means what are the advantage and the disadvantage of using punishment. So you will have an idea, the advantage and the limitation of punishment. The other theory of learning is shaping, or you can call it as behavioral shaping. What is behavioral shaping? Is a learning process. What is the procedure of shaping? You will explain this point too. Question 24, or the chapter key question. What are the implications of operant conditioning? First, you will explain the meaning, the concept, the psychologist who formulated or developed operant conditioning. You will put the meaning, the definition of operant conditioning. Then you will going to identify or scrutinize or figure out the advantage, the implications, the importance of using operant conditioning in the learning process as one important theory. 25, what is social learning theory, or sometimes it is called as observational learning theory? You are going to define, you are going to identify, you are going to be acquainted with the point social learning or observational learning. Lastly, you will describe the theory of cognitive learning, which is latent and insight learning. So these are some of important questions, chapter key questions, everybody should understand at the end of this chapter to get a big picture, or to get a full picture about chapter 3, which is learning and